mountain, in the valley, in the crowded streets, or the empty desert, in our hope and in our waiting, we are never alone. God is with us.
That is correct, and that is what we're going to be looking at in this series over the next 4 weeks. We're going to focus on the topic of God being with us. No matter where we find ourselves, God is there with us, and we are thankful for that truth, and we're reminded of that as we come into the month of December, as we begin to set our sights and our attention towards Christmas. We remind ourselves of that truth, that God is with us. And so this week, we begin a 4-week series called God With Us, and it's a 2019 Christmas series we're going to be looking at over the next 4 weeks. Before we jump into the text today, I do want to just say a couple things. First of all, I do want to encourage you, as Pastor Brennan said on the announcement video, I want to encourage you to help support Give Christmas Away. If you haven't signed up to help with that, be sure to see Karen Apple. She has a table set up down in the kids' wing, right there in that corner, down below here in the kids' ministry hallway. Be sure to see her. We're trying to help 40 families this year, provide Christmas for them. That's 115 kids and 63 adults that we're trying to help this Christmas season. There's still a lot of tags left, and the way that works, you pick up one of those tags, and then you go purchase those gifts and bring them back in, and then we provide Christmas to all of those families, something we've been doing here for a long time. And I think even the text today reveals why we would do things like this. We'll see that. And then also, just want to mention this, starting next week, we will begin giving you opportunities to give towards our annual birthday offering for Christ. Most of that will be going towards our 2020 vision and towards the funds that we're trying to raise for this project, for the renovation work that we've done here. But we are going to be using a percentage of it to give to a specific missionary that has a great opportunity that God has opened a door for him, and also for a family in our church that's in need. We're going to be using a percentage of that to help with those two needs this year as well. And so you can start giving towards that next week by marking anything birthday offering for Christ or 2020 vision. We'll have a special offering the Sunday before Christmas. Let's jump into our message today. We are going to be looking at Matthew chapter 1, and so if you want to take your Bibles and turn to Matthew chapter 1, you can do that. For the next 4 weeks, we are going to be in Matthew chapter 1 and 2. You'll find it, if you need to, in the back of one of the pew Bibles. If you don't have a Bible with you, take one of those Bibles out of the back of the pew and turn to page 757. You'll find Matthew chapter 1 there. While you're turning there, I want to tell you the story. There was a certain law professor who used to, every time he would begin his class, first class of the year, every time he would begin that, he would start his first class by putting 2 numbers on the board. He would put a 4 on the board, and then out beside that he would put a 2, and it would look something like this. And then he would ask the class, what is the solution? And the class would, someone would yell out, 6. He'd shake his head, no. Somebody else would yell out, 2. Shake his head, no. Others would yell out, 8. Shake his head, no. And then he would say this, the reason you have failed to come up with the solution is because you failed to ask the single most important question. What is the problem? Because you never asked what is the problem, you cannot accurately arrive at the solution. What I want to say today to you is this, that we are living in a world and in a culture that is frantically trying to find solutions, but they don't even really know what the problem is. And you cannot really find the solution until you really know what the true problem is. We're in a mess in our culture today. Nobody argues with that. We're in a mess morally, socially, emotionally. And everyone seems to be looking for solutions, but the problem is no one knows what the real problem is. So what we're going to do over the next 4 weeks is we're going to be looking into Matthew chapter 1 and 2. And in Matthew, in this gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, he answers for us the question of what is the solution. Luke read the solution to us early as we began the service today. The solution is found in chapter 1, verse 23, and the solution is they shall call his name Emmanuel. We talk about Jesus coming, and that we were told, the angel told us that we would call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. God with us. That's the solution. But Matthew's also going to explain what the problem is so that we can know we have the right solution in Jesus as we know what the correct problem is that we're dealing with. So let's look at Matthew chapter 1, and I want to read this. I want you to follow along with me in Matthew chapter 1 as we read through verses 1 through 17. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And it says Perez was the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, or Aram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. And Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amoz, and Amoz the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation of Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Hakim, and Hakim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Matthan, and Matthan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And suddenly a change in the pattern. Not Jacob, the father of Jesus, but Jacob, the father of Joseph. Not Joseph, the father of Jesus, but Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. And from David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. Wasn't that fun? What I want to do today, I want to try to outline for you, and let me tell you, we could do a lot more, but I'm just going to do 3 points. There's a lot more here than what meets the eye. There are a lot of things written in this list, in this genealogical record, that are here for a very specific reason. Things are written in a certain way. Details are outlined for us for specific reasons. We're just going to look at 3 things. I'm going to give you today 3 powerful practical points from a seemingly pointless genealogical report. That's what we're going to look at. 3 powerful practical points from a seemingly pointless genealogical report. We read through this and you thought, where is this going? It's going to get to something. Have you ever watched one of those movies? You watch a movie and it's like you think, like it's going to, at some point, something is going to happen. And then you feel like nothing ever really does. Did you feel like that as we were reading that? I had somebody recommend a movie one time to us, and Alice and I watched it, and the whole movie was set within a wooden box that a soldier was buried in the desert. You kept thinking like he's going to get out or something, like something's going to happen. You could hear noises. You couldn't see anything else, but you kept watching because you thought something is going to happen, and nothing ever did. Maybe you feel like that when we read this genealogical record. Seems like a pointless report. I mean, yes, it tells us that Jesus was born, but what's the point of all this? I want to point out some things today. Genealogical lists do seem pointless, especially the further disconnected that we get from them. I mean, the same is true for you and I. The further we get disconnected from the time in which the list of people are, we seem to think that the meaning is less and less. But when we know the stories and when we know the background behind, the details behind the individuals listed, it makes all the difference in the world. Let me illustrate that for you. So, recently, I found out some interesting details about my own genealogical record going back a few generations. So I had seen a list. My grandfather, who's 91, has this little book, and he's got this little book that somebody put together that goes back to his great-grandfather. So that'd be my great-great-great, that's 3, grandfather. Well, I had seen this list before. I had kind of seen this list of names, and it just kind of provided a record of, family members and children and grandchildren and all of this. It was just a listing of names, but I had never really paid much attention to it until I started looking and reading. There are actually stories recorded in there, and as I found out more of the stories about the individuals that were listed, it became more meaningful, and it meant a little something more to me. And just over the last few months, I was sitting with him looking through this book and looking at some of these stories and discovered some things I'd never really looked at and paid attention to because I just looked at the list and thought, this is so disconnected from me. But actually looking at the stories. One interesting story is this. My grandfather, he had a grandmother named Cornelia. His grandmother's name was Cornelia James before she married a Smith, and that's kind of where ultimately the Smith kind of came from. And so her name was Cornelia James. And a couple years ago, I was with my grandfather down at the cemetery where he has grave plots and all that, and we were looking at details and working out some things. And my grandfather, I noticed his grandfather was buried over here, but his grandmother wasn't. And so I asked him about that, and he said, well, yeah. He said, she's buried way over there on the other side of the cemetery. I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, he said, he was a mean man and, just angry all the time, and she just couldn't live with him. So she moved out, up through the woods, 300 yards, had her own place built, but she still fixed him and brought him 2 meals every day. Anyway, I said, well, that's wild. And then that just kind of interested me a little bit. That was his grandmother. I looked at some pictures. I found some old photographs, and just looking at the photographs, I'm not sure how easy she was to live with either, but I don't know her. But then, as I started reading, I found this was the guy that it traced back to, my great-great-great-grandfather. His name was Reuben James. This is a picture of him. You can see the similarities. This was my great-great-great-grandfather, Reuben James. As I started reading through all of this, reading stories, looking at newspaper articles, I found some really interesting things. And it was the stories that made this interesting. One story was this. Take a look at the next picture. He was 94 when he died, and just before he died, he led the parade in Union County back in 1940. He was the last living Confederate veteran, the last living soldier who had fought as a Confederate soldier in the Civil War. Of course, in the articles, he referred to it as the War on Northern Aggression. But nonetheless, that was him. I thought, well, that's interesting. He was a Confederate soldier. But what's more interesting is when you read the story, there's a newspaper article that's put in this book from him, and you find out he actually was fighting and he was in battle, and when 2 of his fellow soldiers died in his arms, he made a vow to God that he would get saved whenever he got out if God would just, protect him. He got out, he went back to Union County, and there he went to a church and he put his faith and trust in Jesus Christ. A few years after that, he stepped into a call to ministry, and for 60 years, he was a Baptist pastor and preacher at different churches in the Union County area. And then here's a picture of him like in 1910 or something like that on his way to church. Take a look at that. Isn't that interesting? 1 horsepower vehicle, 1 horsepower. So I looked at this list You just see a listing of names, and it doesn't really mean anything to you. You just see a listing of grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, and it doesn't seem to mean anything. You go back and you actually read the stories. I was partly interested because I was afraid I was related to Jesse James because of the James family, but that's not. We wrote him out of the record. But that was interesting. The stories and the background details and the people and their experiences. If that is preserved for you, that's what brings to life some of these records of genealogies. That's what we have in Matthew's record. He gives for us details that help us to understand stories, and as we understand those stories, we see what he's trying to say. In fact, Matthew writes in a specific way, giving these details to make a point. His main point in writing this gospel is to establish that Jesus is the Messiah. He's the long-anticipated one, the heir to the promises that were made to David and the promises that were made to Abraham. The promise made to David was that one would come who would sit on the throne of David and who would rule the nation of Israel in righteousness and justice. And the promise is made to Abraham that through his descendants there would be blessings brought to all the earth. That's why Matthew begins the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, son of Abraham. He wants to connect everything back to these two figures in the history of the nation of Israel who received these promises and these covenants from God. Jesus is the one. So let's look at these points from this seemingly pointless genealogical record. Let me give you the first. The first one is this. The Gospel of Matthew gives us good news. Gives us good news. Not fake news and not merely good advice, but it gives us good news. In fact, the word translated genealogy in verse 1 is the word where we get the word Genesis. Genesis, we know, means beginnings. It means beginnings. That's where the very first book in the Old Testament gets its meaning from, the beginnings of everything, Genesis. The book of Genesis in the very beginning of the Old Testament gives us the true story of one beginning. How did it all begin? It all began in the beginning, God, right? Genesis starts out, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis gives us the beginnings, one beginning. But here in Matthew, the book of the genealogy, the book of the Genesis, the beginning of Jesus Christ. Matthew is saying in Genesis in the Old Testament, we had the beginning, one beginning. But here in the Gospel of Matthew, he's saying in Jesus there is a new beginning, a new beginning. And Matthew doesn't start out once upon a time. He's not giving fake news. He's not writing fairy tale for us. Matthew doesn't start out once upon a time. No, he starts out by giving us details about people and places that you can check all of these facts to make sure that what he is reporting for us is not fake news. It's not fairy tale. It's not fiction. It is good news. It is true. It is real. It is rooted in history. This is the beginning of Jesus Christ, who comes to us all the way back from Abraham and from David, all the way to Jesus. He's also not giving us good advice. He's not giving us good advice. He's giving us news of what has already happened. See, this matters. What Matthew's doing is he's not saying, let me give you some tips for how to live your life. He's telling us what has already happened, which provides the very foundation for everything that we can experience in life, for everything. He's not giving us good advice. See, let me illustrate that. Like, for example, if a town was facing a military invasion from another army, all right, say one country and one town was concerned about a military invasion from another army. That it was in the future yet. Well, what would you need? You would need military advice. You'd need somebody to come into your town to get your leaders together and to say, hey, you need to prepare for the coming invasion. And there would be advice given. You need to set up, depending upon the time period, right? You need to set up like archers on the wall, on this wall. You need to set up, your catapult system facing in this direction. Here's where they're coming from. You would need advice, all right? Prepare for the coming battle. But, If your town and your country had already successfully defended itself from a military invasion, the king knew about it, defended it, headed it off, stopped it, well, what would you need? You would need messengers to go out and to spread the good news of what has already happened. That's what Matthew is doing. Matthew is providing for us the beginning of Jesus, and he's outlining for us good news of what has already been done. He's not giving us good advice. He's reporting for us good news. If we trace all of this back to the very beginning where the problem first originated, we'll go back to Genesis chapter 3, and that's where the problem is found, where Adam and Eve sinned. And what Matthew is doing through the way he reports this, he's reporting to us that the problem that began then is finding its solution in Jesus. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, God said to the serpent, he made this promise. He promised one that would come. And he said to the serpent, I'll put enmity, I'll put hostility, I'll put enmity between you and the woman. And he said, I'll put enmity between your seed, your offspring, your seed, and he said her seed. You don't normally talk like that. You normally speak about the seed originating from the man, but God said, I'll bring one through her seed who will bruise the head of the serpent. In Jesus, we find that in Matthew chapter 1, verse 16, we see Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and then of whom? It changes. The whole pattern changes, demonstrating that Jesus was not a physical heir of Joseph. He was Joseph was his legal father, but he physically descended from Mary, of whom is the feminine. It's the feminine relative pronoun, meaning it refers directly back to Mary. Jesus was born of her. Even in that, we see this hearkening back to Genesis 3. Her seed will bruise the head of the serpent. The Gospel of Matthew is reporting that one is here. Matthew is giving us good news, not fake news and not merely good advice. The second one I want to make, and I want to spend a little more time on this one today. I think this is maybe the most practical of the points is this. The second point I want to make to you today is this, that a dysfunctional family, I think this is what's going on in this report. He's outlining for us this truth, that a dysfunctional family may describe your past and even your present, but it doesn't have to determine your future. He's making this point by some of the details that he outlines for us, and I think you'll see that very clearly. We call this a genealogy, but some have pointed out that it's really more like a resume. It's really more like a resume. In the History of Grace, Tim Keller pointed out that in this day, we tinker with our resume a little bit, much like they would have done in the past as well. And a genealogical report was everything. Genealogies were like your resume. Who you descended from, who your father was and your grandfather was, that meant something for who you were and who you could be. Your resume was really your genealogical report, and people kind of played around with that a little bit like they do today. For example, if you went to college A, but you didn't finish, you dropped out, you played around too much, you skipped class too much, you dropped out. Later, you went to college B and you graduated. Well, when you put your resume together, most of you aren't going to list college A. You're going to start with college, B, right? That looks a little better. So, we do that a little bit today. Well, that's a little bit of what's going on in that time as well. People would oftentimes mess with and play with their genealogical record. They would tinker with things. In fact, Herod the Great, history reveals to us, Herod the Great, who was the Herod at the time that Jesus was born, Herod the Great, he himself published a list of his genealogical record. Herod was the king of Judea. And he said, well, I need to let people know. I want to publish this reality, tell people who I've descended from. I need to give affirmation to, validation to, support of who I am and the fact that I belong. I should be king of Judea. So Herod the Great published a genealogical record. But the problem was there were some people in his family tree that he didn't really want there. Didn't make him look so good. So you know what Herod did? He purged it. He did away with people that were in his family tree and in his genealogical record. He got rid of them because it didn't look so good to have them in his family tree. Jesus doesn't do that. He lays out for us the ones that are in his family tree, and he does the exact opposite. He doesn't purge the record. He lets it stand as it is, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let me give you an example. 5 women are listed in the genealogical record of Jesus here. You have Tamar listed, you have Rahab listed, you have Ruth, then you have the wife of Uriah. That's how it's listed. And you have Mary, who is Jesus' mother. Women were not usually included in ancient genealogical records. Matthew lists them, and he emphasizes this to show how God reverses the world's discrimination and marginalization of women. He uses them to bring about his purposes, and he includes them in the record because they were central to the story. Let me give you one example. The first woman that's listed in verse 3 is Tamar. It says this, Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Now, he includes that in that way for a specific reason. Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience. They would have known the Old Testament stories very well. They definitely would have known this story when they read that. They wouldn't have forgotten it. And once I tell it to you, I doubt you'll ever forget it as well if you're not familiar with it. It's found in Genesis 38. We're not going to take the time to read through it today, but I would encourage you to do so. Genesis 38 tells us the story of how Judah fathered these 2 children. He fathered these 2 sons, Perez and Zerah, by Tamar. Who was Tamar? Tamar was actually Judah's daughter-in-law. Tamar was Judah's daughter-in-law that he fathered these 2 children with. What happened was, she was married to one of his sons. Judah had 3 sons. She was married to one. He was a wicked, evil guy, and so God just wasn't going to put up with that, and so God took his life before they were able to have children. Well, in Deuteronomy, the Jewish law called for if a woman was not able to have children and her husband died, if her husband had a brother, then it was his duty to go in and to allow for her to have offspring and to have children. So Judah's second son, I think his name was Onan goes in, but he doesn't really want to have kids with Tamar. I don't know. He's not a good guy either. He's evil, wicked. It makes it clear in the text of Genesis 38. You know, his older brother died. Now it's his duty to, he doesn't want to really do it. The King James puts it delicately. You know, he wouldn't really seal the deal, but the King James put it delicately. Every time he would go in unto her, it says he just spilled it on the ground so that she couldn't conceive. The King James, puts it real delicately like that. Anyway, so that's what happened. Well, God didn't appreciate this either. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. So God takes his life too. Now Judah is saying, all right, wait a minute. 2 sons, both dead. Maybe Tamar's the curse. Maybe she's the problem. I'm not going to give her, he's thinking, I'm not giving her my 3rd son. Not letting that happen. Obviously, there's a problem with her. So he stalls. He delays. He decides, I'll just drag this out for a while. She realizes this isn't going anywhere. He's delaying. He's stalling. He's never going to give me his 3rd son so that I can have children. I can be taken care of. I can have descendants. So she realizes that her father-in-law, Judah, has a problem with prostitutes. So she dresses up like one. She goes out somewhere away from town where she knows he's going to be coming by, and she presents herself disguised as a prostitute. So she conceives. 3 months later, and Judah doesn't know. He doesn't know this was his daughter-in-law. 3 months later, she starts showing. Other men of the town come and They tell Judah, obviously, your daughter-in-law has been unfaithful. She's been immoral. She's committed immorality with some other man. You need to stone her. So, well, that solves the problem, right? Whew, now I don't have to give her my third son. So they go and they bring her out. They drag her out. They prepare to stone her. And she says something along the lines of, I have with me the belt of the man whose children these belong to. And it's the belt of Judah, her father-in-law. Well, that was awkward for him. Can you imagine? Hey, look, let me just say this. You thought you had an awkward family Thanksgiving. Could you imagine Thanksgiving there, right? Could you imagine Thanksgiving for Judah and his family? Imagine Thanksgiving that year. Well, Matthew doesn't gloss over this. He doesn't say Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, and then move on. He says, by Tamar. He wants to call that to our minds. Why? Because Jesus isn't hiding any of that. He is making it plain and clear. He himself came from a very dysfunctional, sin-filled family tree. Dysfunctional family. Family that is messed up by sin describes all of us to some degree. But Matthew's making the point for us, and I hope that you take this away from this today. It doesn't matter what your past is. It doesn't matter what your present may be. That may describe where you've come from. It may describe what your environment looks like, but it doesn't have to determine your future. Jesus came through all of that, came out of that. God, in the midst of all of that, in the midst of all the mess, God worked a miracle. And Matthew reports these details for us to say something about that. God doesn't do things the way the world does. Herod, he gets rid of people he doesn't want in his family tree. Jesus allows it to be revealed and has it written in such a way that it reports all of that, because God does things the opposite from the things of the world. This Christmas, the world's thinking about how they can get the most expensive gifts for themselves. The world is thinking about how they can go out and they can buy all of these elaborate gifts for their family, how they can get the most elaborate gifts for themselves. They're watching the commercial about the husband and wife buying the black truck and the red SUV for each other, and they're going, that could be us this year. But following Christ calls us to something very different. We're going to spend money that we would spend on ourselves, and we're going to buy Christmas for other families. Why? Because God does things the opposite from the way the world does. They get rid of the dysfunction of their family. They hide it. Jesus doesn't. No matter what your past or present is, God wants you to overcome that, and you can in Christ. He is the solution. The third point I want to make is this: the Christian faith isn't for people who have it all put together, but for those who know they don't and trust the only one who does. Why is Jesus the answer? Why is the gospel the answer? Because it teaches us this. Christianity isn't for those that have it all together. You're not sitting with people who have it all put together this morning. You're sitting with people who know they don't have it all put together, but who trust the only one who does. You're not listening to someone preach this morning who has it all put together. You're listening to someone preach who knows he doesn't have it all together, but trusts in the only one that does. See, in this list, you have all kinds of outsiders that are listed. Moral outsiders. You have prostitutes in this list. You have Rahab. You have illegitimate children in this list that were given birth out of immorality. You have an incestuous relationship that is described in this list. You have Gentiles in this list. You have moral outsiders, you have racial outsiders, you have gender outsiders, people who were excluded by everyone, but Jesus brings them in, and they're a part of what God was trying to do. down through the ages. Jesus brings them in. What's the point here? What's the example of David? In verse 6, David was the father of Solomon. And it doesn't even say by Bathsheba, but it says by the wife of Uriah. Why? See, Jesus brings them in. People who don't have it all together. By the wife of Uriah. It doesn't name her as Bathsheba. Why? That's not a slam against Bathsheba. That's a slam against David. I mean, if you're reading through this record and you go, oh, King David, we want him in our family tree. He is a king. But it says, no, look at his sin. He gave birth to Solomon. Solomon was birthed by him through the wife of Uriah. Who was Uriah? Uriah was one of David's good friends. When David was running from Saul before he was the king, he was hiding out in mountains, and he had a group of mighty men who would protect him, and they put their life on the line to protect him. Uriah was one of those ones who was out there protecting David. Later, when David became the king, Uriah was fighting in the battle as one of his soldiers for the army. While he was away, David took his wife, Bathsheba. When he couldn't cover it up, he had Uriah killed, and then he brought her in. And Solomon was born ultimately later through that relationship. And the point that Matthew is making here is the Christian faith isn't for people who have it all put together, but for those who know they don't, and they trust in the only one who does. You got King David. You've got kings. You've got prostitutes. You've got all these outsiders. The point is this: if we receive the grace of Jesus Christ, prostitutes and kings sit down as equals. In this world, kings are elevated and they're lifted higher. Sinners and people who seem to have nothing are pushed away. God says in Jesus, they're all brought together. Because really sin, the problem, has leveled the playing field. And we can't do anything about that ourselves. It only takes the one who can. Jesus, he is the answer. That's why when we get to chapter 1, verse 22, we're told all of it took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. The problem is we've all sinned. Every one of us. But the solution is that God has come and he has made his presence among us. He has come and lived among us in the person of Jesus. The problem is sin, but the solution is God is with us. And that changes everything. That's good news. That is good news. That means that our past and what we're living in the present doesn't have to define our future, because Jesus changes all of that for us. And it means that you don't have to do anything to be saved. God has done that. You receive that. You receive God's grace. I want to ask the band, if they will, to come, and I want to ask you to bow your heads and close your eyes this morning. As the band comes to close our service with the song, and with your heads bowed and eyes closed, I want to just say one thing to you. All of this is made possible by Jesus. Jesus, one of his main messages was not work, save yourself. No, his message was not work to save yourself. His message was, in him you'll find rest. And in John chapter 1, verse 12, we're told, as many as receive him, to them he gives the right to become the children of God. The message of this month and of this series is that God is and has come. He has come with us. God is with us. And all it takes is for us to just receive that. And that changes everything. Have you received him? That would be my question to you. Have you received him? Father, today we focus on you. We focus on your goodness. We look at the mess that we have made of things. Oh, man, we look at the stories recorded for us in the Scriptures, and we look at the list of the people that were in your son's family tree and lineage. And we read these stories, and Matthew calls them to our memory for these reasons, that we'll understand what's really going on there and understand that no one, no matter how good they may look, has it all put together. It's only in Jesus that we find hope. He is the solution. May we put our hope and our trust and our faith in Him. May we rest in Him. May we give you the glory for what you've done as we worship you this Christmas season. In Jesus' name we pray.